Hello class, welcome to the Art of Story 1020 in Mars at Tri-C Cuyahoga Community College for the summer 2014 semester. This is the first online lecture that you are seeing and viewing. This lecture is assigned to be viewed today, Tuesday, June 16th. You have from now until 11:59 p.m. to view this lecture and take the quiz afterwards. The lecture will be very short, only running about 20 minutes. Today's lecture is on three-act structure. As you have read and as we've talked about, Aristotle breaks story, dramatic story specifically, into three parts: a beginning, middle, and end. And many filmmakers have found that that is exactly what they're doing when they're telling stories. Jean-Luc Godard says that every story must have a beginning, middle, and end, not necessarily in that order. As we talked about in class, what that means is you are going to have the open of your film, you will have the middle of your film, and you will have the end of your film. Your open does not always have to be the beginning of the story. You may open with the middle of the story, or you may open, as some films do, with your main character dying, which would be the end of the story. But you're still going to always open your film. There are certain things that you do in the opening of the film, and certain things you do in the middle of your film, and certain things you do towards the end of your film. And just as I said that Aristotle studied from the plays that were being told at the time when he was writing, he was understanding which were the more popular plays and which were the least popular plays. And when we look at those most popular plays and least popular plays, we find that the popular plays tend to have something in common. So again, like Robert McKee said, this isn't a rule, this is a principle. It's the same as what we see in science. It's not as though Einstein created the rule of gravity and therefore said everything that goes up must come down. He observed the principle. He saw that this is what happens in the world around him. And so these principles we're going to talk about in the three-act structure are what we see in stories, in the really wonderful stories and the really wonderful films that happen around us. Once we become writers, once we become screenwriters and media content creators, we now want to understand what makes a strong media work strong. So we'll now take these things that we see happening around us and we will intentionally put them into our work. That's like a craftsman. When you have someone who's really well at, the original crafts from where the term guild comes from, the masonry. When you have masons, understanding what makes a stronger building stand, what makes a stone wall stand without the use of cement or a lot of the technology we have today. They took these practices, they saw around them what worked, and then they shared it with each other. They practiced these elements, they practiced these principles and became masters of it. That's a craft. So this is the craft of screenwriting. This screenwriting is going to apply to commercials, documentaries. There are some music videos that are narrative, and so they apply the three-act structure. Public service announcements, or what we understand as PSAs, apply the three-act structure. Most of the content that you find in America is applying the three-act structure because, as we talked about, most of the content we see in America is narrative. So three-act structure and narrative should go hand to hand for you in your mind. Understanding how you're going to open your film, how you're going to proceed through the middle of your film, and how you're going to close your film is all going to have to be part of your conversation, whether you've been hired or whether you are deciding to make a short documentary or a public service announcement or a commercial or a television show or even a short media clip that is going to go on someone's website and sort of sell maybe their restaurant or sell their graphic design business or sell a cupcake shop. In all those instances, you want to shape your project and think about your project in terms of what is the beginning, what's the middle, and what's the end. So in three-act structure, we are going to look at what elements are actually happening each one of those sections. Robert McKee, Chapter 2, he starts to talk to you about acts, about scenes, about acts, about events. For the purposes of being craftsmen, which Robert McKee is not, he did not write a screenplay, he does not create media content. Instead, he reads them. So he's like Aristotle. He observes them and he takes a look at the principles that he finds in the most successful of them. So his understanding of scene is not exactly how we as media creators want to understand scene. Dramatic writers and directors, producers will talk about a scene and there's something very much more specific than even what Robert McKee. So the definition, so I wish that I could, put in an animation that says vocabulary right here. Take note on what I'm about to say. The definition of scene is that is a dramatic action that happens in the same time and the same space. So if you have a dramatic action that happens in the kitchen and then the dramatic action moves to the living room, you have a new scene. You just moved spaces. You've left the kitchen and entered the living room. At the moment you leave the kitchen, you end that act. The same thing is true of time. If you have a dramatic action that takes place in the morning and then it moves into the afternoon, you have two separate scenes. You have a scene in the morning and you have a scene in the afternoon, because your scene in the morning is one particular time. Your scene in the afternoon is a different time. If your dramatic action continues from the living room in the morning to the kitchen in the afternoon, you have two scenes that move from one to the other, and that is a sequence. So a scene is one time and one space. The moment you change time, you have a new scene. The moment you change space, you have a new scene. Now, there are a few things that we want to see happen in a dramatic action, and we'll become more detailed about that as we look in scene study. But one of the things that we do want to see happen in a dramatic action are some of the things that we already talked about that we see in action, that we see in drama. So we want there to be a character, and we want there to be conflict. So those are elements that we say exist in a dramatic action. If you're developing a scene in which something happens in the morning in the kitchen and yet there's no sense of tension, there's no sense of conflict, there's no sense of character, then you do not have a narrative scene. So in those terms, you want to understand that each scene is a complete dramatic action. We'll get into the details of all the variety of that, because dramatic action, as we saw with Luxo Jr., does not necessarily need to be a human being that's that character. Tension is not always, two people fighting. We saw that in Luxo Jr., tension was just the ball deflated. So we can have some very subtle characters and subtle tensions, but we need to have both those elements in one dramatic action before we leave that time and before we leave that space. We want to have an understanding of those things. So a scene we see will build into an act. We'll have several scenes that can create a sequence. Once that sequence has a complete dramatic action in itself, so once each one of those scenes adds up to a larger development of the character and a larger dramatic action, so that tension that we need to see, once that is larger over the course of the sequence and completes itself, now we're looking at an act. So an act is not necessarily demarked by there being 2 scenes or 3 scenes or 7 or 8 scenes. An act is demarked by a character being developed and a tension being developed to complete one dramatic action. So you can see all of our units, we're just looking at smaller units of dramatic action that are happening. You can have, and oftentimes in theater you will see this, an act that completely has one scene. So that means an act that has several dramatic actions creating a large arcing dramatic action, but it has one time and one space. There's a film, My Dinner with Andre, that takes place over the course of a dinner. Its first act is one scene because it doesn't, now the film does have a shift in time, so there are different scenes in the entirety of the film, but in that first act we're going to see one place and one space for it. There are other films that are an example of that. A lot of times plays will take advantage of that. Now when it comes to production, there's some logistical reasons why you would want to take advantage of that. A theater may choose to take advantage of that because it means they build one set, one backdrop, one set of furniture pieces for their particular theater, one lighting cue. And so you're there for the entirety of the film with not so much expensive production value or production changes. It's still high quality. We don't want to equate low, overhead with low quality. Those things do not have to be the same. Very often they are, but this is where we as media content creators hold ourselves to a certain standard. You'll see the same thing happening in a film. You'll hear a filmmaker say that to save money on his film, he chose to have fewer locations. He chose to have fewer, ultimately, what would be fewer lighting cues, fewer lighting setups. And by that, that's time. That's the time element. We recognize if we didn't have a clock, if we didn't have our cell phones, if we had nothing, no computer that told us what time it was, we as human beings would know what time it is by the light in the sky. So that's ultimately the production value for putting the time of day, is you want to understand what the lighting is in the scene. What does it look like? Is it dark? Is it bright? Is it dawn? Is it afternoon? Those are the things that you're looking at, which will tell you something about lighting. So there is, in media content creation, we are usually somewhat aware of how our writing is going to affect our production value. Each writer is a little different. There are some writers that completely don't want to think about the production constraints they have, write, and then apply the production to the writing. There are other writers and producers who will think about the production constraints first and then write to that. It's your choice, but the two do marry each other, reflect each other, and balance each other out. At some point, you will have to look at them in tandem. So acts and scenes are one of the first things that people are considering when they're thinking, do I want to change time of day? Do I want to change location, space? If I don't want to change time or space, then I'm going to be in one scene. Now that means that I'm still going to have my dramatic actions take place. So again, a scene takes place in the same time and the same space. That is a scene. An act is a series of dramatic events that add up to one dramatic movement. So an act is a series of dramatic events that add up to one dramatic movement. Notice, again, I didn't say it's a series of scenes, because we may have one scene that in itself has a series of dramatic acts that add up to one dramatic movement. So what's the movement? If an act is defined not necessarily by page count, if an act isn't defined the way a scene is, kind of a scene now is easier to define because we know if we change our time, if we change our space, we're in a different scene. But if an act, how do we know when we have a dramatic movement? How do we know when we've completed a dramatic movement? We're going to understand that a dramatic movement is when we take ultimately when we take a character from point A to point B. That's a dramatic movement. So what are some of those point A, point B? In Act 1, there's a specific point A and point B. Act 1, our point A, is the current life of that character. We call it the status quo. How old is that character? Where does that character live? Who are the friends or family of this character? What's the life of this character? Does he go to work? Does he stay at home? Does he go to school? What are the things that this character has in their life that make up the understanding of who they are? That's our status quo. That's our point A. When we come to the end of our beginning, when we come to the end of Act 1, we want to see that character move to point B. Point B is what we call the call to action. It is the moment in which the character is launched into the dramatic action of the entire film. Once you move the character from point A to point B, from their status quo to their call to action, you have completed a dramatic movement. You've completed your Act 1. Now there's some things that we also want to do for our story in Act 1. We do want to establish the time that this story is taking place of, its period. Is it the 1970s Russia? Is it 1980s USA? And so again, we see with setting, there is this presence of time and space. What is the time and space that we're in? So you want to establish that. If this is a high school, if the story takes place in high school among high school students, we want in those opening scenes for high school to be very vibrant, for the life, the constraints, the stresses, the joys of being a teenager, that teenage angst. We want to see that come through in your opening. So your opening, your Act 1, is really devoted to sucking your audience into your story, sucking them into the time and space of your story. If your film's taking place in the South in the 1860s, you want to very quickly establish for the audience, bring them in, suck them into a place that's very different from their own. This would be a place that in America that has segregation that's going on, and that would be very odd for us to see today. But the moment you're in that film, all of a sudden it's like you've time traveled. You want your film to be so complete, detailed, and feel so real that your audience loses themselves. Remember, we talked about that to really have a strong narrative, you want to put your audience in the time and the space of the character and make the story real for them. So you're going to spend a lot of focus in Act 1 on setting up your setting, making the people real, making the setting real. And that has to do with dialogue. You want your characters to really speak in the way that is natural and authentic for whatever setting and time and space you're in. For wherever you are geographically, that's also in